The OECD's Pisa publication is one of the most respected international studies of education systems. This week, they reported that Scotland's results have declined to record lows. The 2023 study shows the worst ever performance in maths, science and reading. What does Humza Yousaf have to say to the generation of young Scots that have been failed by the SNP?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, before I do answer the question, this is also the first opportunity for me to do so in this chamber. Can I also pay tribute to Lord Darling? Alistair Darling was a dedicated public servant, a giant of Scottish and UK politics. In my last interaction with Alistair Darling just a couple of months ago, we ran into each other in Edinburgh Airport, and he took the opportunity to seek me out, to congratulate me the role that I'm in, and to say that if ever I wanted a brief and even discreet conversation or advice, then he was always on the other end of a telephone. I think for somebody who's in a different political party, that shows the mark, it shows the integrity of the individual. So he will be hugely missed from our public life. My thoughts, and certainly I know the thoughts of the entire chamber, are with his wife Margaret, his children, his family, our Labour colleagues, but indeed anybody that had any association with Alistair Darling undoubtedly will be missing him. So I hope all of those who do grieve his loss can take some comfort from the many, many tributes that have poured in over the last week. In relation to the substance of the question that Douglas Ross asks, let me put it on record and let me be absolutely explicit about it, that we do not dismiss, I do not dismiss, nor take lightly the PISA results that have been released this week. We are reflecting on a poor set of results, and the Education Secretary will make a statement next week on the very issues of literacy and numeracy and what our response is to improving those outcomes. There is no doubt, of course, as the OECD makes it clear in the publication, that COVID has had an impact. The OECD described it as their COVID edition, and that's why 40 countries that's why 30 out of the 40 countries saw their results go down in maths, and it's why across all three categories of reading, maths and science, every nation in the UK, including Scotland, saw reductions in their scores. So these results will, of course, be carefully considered. They are a poor set of results, but I do have to say, Presiding Officer, that some of the commentary around Scottish education from this one set of results is, I think, unfair. Let's look at the holistic picture, not just one data set. And what we see, of course, is that investment in education per pupil is higher in Scotland than it is in England and Wales. And as a result of that investment, we've seen 94.3% of 16 to 90-year-olds in employment, education or training. That's a record number. So to suggest that from one set of results that the education system is failing, as Douglas Ross is doing, is simply not true. And frankly, it's an insult to the brilliant job our teachers do.
Douglas Ross.
It's an insult for the First Minister to say he is reflecting on this poor set of results when the PISA figures have been going down throughout the SNP's time in office. Scores have fallen year on year in maths and science since the SNP took over, and reading is at a record low. And there is no surprise, I believe, in this chamber or anywhere else to hear the First Minister reach for COVID as the excuse. This was a global pandemic. This was a global pandemic. We know that countries in East Asia, where the pandemic began, are outperforming Scotland's education system. Lindsay Patterson said this, Professor Lindsay Patterson of the University of Edinburgh. COVID isn't solely responsible for this crisis, although ministers and education chiefs are determined to scapegoat it that way. And let's be very clear. The Scottish education system was once amongst the best in the world, but after 16 years of the SNP being in power, Scotland now ranks below Latvia for science, behind Estonia in reading, behind Lithuania in maths. So will Humza Yousaf finally admit that the SNP's record on schools is a national disgrace?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I don't accept that. But Douglas Ross, deliberately of course, is not listening to my previous response. I am accepting that the Pisa results were not good enough, even considering the impact of the pandemic. And the impact of the pandemic is not something that I'm using as an excuse. It literally is said. The OECD literally described the results as their COVID edition. That came from the OECD, not from the Scottish Government. So the Education Secretary will stand here next week. She will give details of what we're doing to improve literacy and numeracy. However, to suggest our entire education system is completely failing is simply untrue. Let's look at the holistic picture. And Douglas Ross and the Conservatives don't want to listen because, of course, it is an inconvenient truth for them. Last year's ACEL results showed the biggest single-year fall in attainment gap in primary school in both numeracy and literacy. This summer, we had the highest ever number of passes at National 5 in an exam year since the qualification was introduced in 2014. They really don't want to listen to this because it goes against their narrative about Scottish education. Higher and advanced higher passes rates were above those seen pre-pandemic in 2019. We now have a record number of young people aged 19 and under who have secured a university place this year, and more, of course, from areas of higher deprivation. And as I said, 94.3% of 16 to 19-year-olds participating in employment, education or training. This data, those facts, tell us of an education system and a record under this SNP of an education system that is supporting our young people. Presiding Officer.
I'm going to need shorter answers as questions. Douglas Ross.
The First Minister keeps going back to COVID, so let's just see what the director of the Pisa study said. He said that OECD made it clear that attainment was declining long before COVID, and Pisa studies throughout the year show that here in Scotland. And Humza Yousaf needs to accept the extent of his government's failure and examine why this has happened. Many factors will have contributed to this decline, but it cannot be a coincidence that it has taken place during the disastrous implementation of Curriculum for Excellence and its aftermath. Not my words, but the words of Dr. Keir Bloomer, one of the architects of Curriculum for Excellence itself. The SNP's flawed plans have cost Scotland its international reputation for excellence in education. They made schools less about learning. The SNP's curriculum doesn't value knowledge. They tried to save it with mountains of bureaucracy and only made it worse. Isn't it time to accept, after the worst ever school results, that the SNP's curriculum needs to be scrapped?
First Minister.
Well, can I just remind Douglas Ross, of course, that some of the challenges we saw predate Curriculum for Excellence. And as I said, we are taking the Pisa results extremely seriously. That's why the Education Secretary has committed to a ministerial statement in this chamber next week to give details on the action that we'll take on numeracy and literacy. Let me just remind Douglas Ross that it was, of course, Liz Smith, who is in his front bench, who said that she was the Tory education spokesperson at the time. She said, "I want to start the Scottish Conservatives' contribution to the debate with an unequivocal declaration of support for the Curriculum for Excellence." She also said more recently in 2018 that, and I quote again, "Throughout all the interviews and consultations we undertook, there was general agreement that the principles which underpin Curriculum for Excellence, of which which were agreed unanimously by Scotland's political parties, are sound." And again, recently in March 2020, Jamie Green, the then Tory education spokesman, said, and I quote, "The Conservatives will support the Scottish Government, especially in the current climate, in delivering Curriculum for Excellence and improving outcomes for Scotland's young people." So the Conservatives have supported Curriculum for Excellence. They have done so, of course, because of the statistics that I have read, which show that Curriculum for Excellence is working for young people. So what I would say to Douglas Ross is we will continue to invest in education. That's an investment which per pupil is higher than in England and Wales, and we'll make sure that we have an education system that supports good outcomes for our young people, as opposed to knee-jerk reactions from the Conservatives and, of course, a cut to our public services by the UK Conservative Government.
I am going to have to require briefer responses as well as questions. Douglas Ross.
I can't believe the First Minister is standing here defending Scottish education in the week that the results have shown standards to be at their worst ever level. And he has quoted what the Scottish Conservatives have said in the past about curriculum for excellence. But what he hasn't quoted is the problems with the implementation, which is on the SNP's watch. That's why Dr Keir Bloomer said the disastrous implementation of curriculum for excellence is the problem, and that lays at the hands of the SNP. Now let's look at another quote from John Jerome, the Professor of Education at UCL. He said this week: "I think parents probably should be worried. Clearly things are not going well in Scotland. Since the last Pisa results, the SNP have launched reports, independent reviews, national discussions, reform boards and consultations on education, and the one thing they haven't done is fix their mess." The SNP government's own International Council of Educational Advisers have said this: "The time for commissioning reviews is now over. There is a strong consensus. There is a need for action." A generation of Scots have already been failed, and another generation are being let down by the lack of leadership from Humza Yousaf and the SNP. Scottish schools have plummeted down international league tables on the SNP's watch. So what urgent action is Humza Yousaf going to take now, or are parents right to be worried about the future of Scotland's schools?
Minister.
Well, the people of Scotland can take comfort in the fact that, of course, we have an exceptionally good reputation and record in Scottish education, which has seen 94.3% of 16 to 90-year-olds in education, employment or training. That is a record high. As not just a First Minister, but as somebody who also has their child in the local secondary school, I understand completely parents' concerns at the recent Pisa results. I'm not dismissing the fact, I'm not taking lightly by any stretch of the imagination the results, and that's why the Education Secretary will stand up next week and give detail on what we're doing to improve literacy and numeracy. So I've, throughout my responses, accepted that we need to improve our Pisa score. But as for our record, Presiding Officer, on education, we're the party that abolished tuition fees, in very stark contrast to England, where students have to pay up to £9,000 a year. We have more young people in Scotland from areas of deprivation going to university than ever before. Now, the Conservatives want to heckle those young people from deprived areas down, but let me tell you more about our record, Presiding Officer. We have record numbers of young people going to positive destinations. We have seen the biggest single-year fall in the poverty-related, yes, the poverty-related attainment gap in primary in both numeracy and literacy. And all the while we have done that, Presiding Officer, when we have a Tory UK government that has taken a hatchet to our public services and inflicted over 13 years of
First Minister.
austerity.
Question 2. Question